Hey everyone, it's Niamh here and welcome to my art journaling channel. Today we're doing something that I'm really passionate about, and it's layering embossing powders. Now this is one of a two-part series, so in this section I'm going to show you all the different bits and pieces we're making, and in the second section I'll show you different ways to use those pieces we make today. So just a bit of background. From the year about 2000 to 2013 I was involved with making, manufacturing, designing, teaching, demoing using thick embossing enamels called Opals Embossing Powders. But within that I've used lots and lots of embossing powders over my career in all sorts of different ways, and I've learnt over all those years all the different tips and tricks and how they can work. And when I see different things on YouTube, it sometimes does my head in. So these are some of the things I've learnt over those years. So this is the basic kit you need: embossing powders, some chipboard or some cardboard to work on, Glad Bake, which is a silicone type cooking paper, a heat board, which I just used MDF, a tray to collect the embossing powder, cardboard to stamp on as well or emboss on, and a Versamark pad and a reinker. Really, really important. It's the stickiest embossing powder embossing ink I've found on the market, and I've tried them all. And it's vitally, vitally important that you have a reinker as well. It's really important to re-ink when you work. And you can see here, the first thing I do when I go to work on my pad is to re-ink. Now I haven't used this pad in quite a while. It was still quite tacky to the touch, but I wanted to make sure it's going to pick up the paper. And the next thing you'll see me do with the chipboard is really press it in. It has to be really wet and glistening. Otherwise, the embossing powder is just not going to stick. Now you saw there, instead of tipping the embossing powder on, I just dumped all my embossing powder out in my tray, and then I put my chipboard into it, and it picked up all the powder. It wasn't patchy because I'd re-inked my patch. The next thing you've probably seen me do is I didn't stop and let that dry. When it was still hot, I picked up the next layer of powder. And that's really, really important when you're layering embossing powders, because if you put a layer of ink in between each layer, what you'll end up with is 3 or 4 really thin layers of plastic with some liquid in between. Now that can cause boiling of the liquid when you go to reheat it again, especially if you've got a really powerful heat tool, or it can make your layers peel off eventually. So if you actually bond the layers to each other when they're hot, what you get is one solid thick piece of embossing enamel or embossing powder that is not going to chip off. What you saw me doing at the end there is I was just playing around and sprinkling in some different colours of embossing powders. And finally I just put a stamp in. Any stamp will work, and you saw I didn't press it in all that hard, and I'm just going over the top with the Inca Gold. Now I was able to work on that fairly immediately. Because it's a cold stamp, it sets the embossing powder pretty much straight away. Disclaimer, because I've worked with embossing powder for so long, I do have asbestos fingertips. I am able to deal with the heat, but if you notice the way I hold the chipboard, I only hold it very briefly by the edges and I dump it in. I don't hold on to it or worry about it. I just dump it in. So I'm not actually holding it onto it for very, very long. The other thing you'll see me do is with my heat gun, I'm not moving it around all that much, and I am holding it fairly close. Now I was trying to sort of angle it so you could see the embossing powder melt, because that's the most magic part of embossing powder. But it's really important to hold the heat gun over the top, sort of in one area, let it melt and move on to the next bit. A lot of times we saw people moving the heat gun backwards and forwards like I just did there, and what would happen is they'd actually dry out the ink underneath, so the embossing powder would start to blow away. And I think you can see on my board at the moment, I don't have any embossing powder that's gone away. Now the great thing about embossing powder is if you don't like what you've done, you can reheat it and do something else, and that's what I'm showing you here. I put a stamped image in. I didn't mind it, but I just wanted to show you that you can reheat it and it will go perfectly smooth again, and you can do other things. So what I'm doing now is just grabbing my craft knife, and I'm actually marbling the colours I sprinkled on so I can get a marbled pattern onto it. And then when it started to dry a little bit, just heat it up again so it's liquid, and then go back in and marble it again. It doesn't ruin your craft knife. That little knob of embossing powder will just flick straight off. So you can see the marble pattern that I've got there. You can use embossing powders on anything, and what I'm showing you with these colours these are the new Reinker mixed media powders. They're kind of a cross between a normal embossing powder with a little bit of chunky embossing powder thrown through, just to get some different specks of colour. You can use fine embossing enamel to do this, or fine embossing powder to do exactly the same techniques. You just might need a few more coats. You can also use the thick, ultra thick embossing powders. You can get them from Reinker, you can get them from Wow. Those lucky people who've still got some opals around, you can use those as well, and it works in exactly the same way. Basically, the only difference between the thin and the thick is with the thin, you're going to get a really crisp image when you're stamping on cardstock. If you use the thicker stuff, it's going to be a bit more blurry because obviously the crystals are going to melt out that little bit more. So this is some chipboard I've had hanging around for ages. This makes great embellishments on cards, on scrapbook pages, mixed media projects. Embossing powders are really, really flexible for any sort of project that you're doing. You can use them in any sort of way. And the best thing is, because they're in such a range of colours, you can colour coordinate into anything you're doing. Now this is to get a two-tone effect. What I'm doing with the king is I've just heated up the top again, and I'm just dragging it through the other embossing powder. Where it's hot, it's picked up the powder, and that will just melt in, so I get a two-tone effect on my chipboard card. So particularly sort of scrapbookers like that sort of effect of the two-tone two-tone colour on your chipboard. Okay, if I wanted to, I could put a stamp into that as well, but because it's such a fine, detailed piece of chipboard, I've left it as is. You can use MDF to do this as well, to colour up your MDF. You can cut your own card. You can pretty much do it on anything that will take heat. In this video, I'm just using the layered embossing. I'm not actually going into how to emboss on a card and so on, because there's plenty of tutorials out there on that. So I just thought I'd do something slightly different and something that's particularly in my wheelhouse. So for this project, for the larger one, I'm actually using a thicker embossing powder in gold, and I'm again just heating it up. Now at this stage my heat gun's fairly hot, so it's melting fairly quickly, and gold embossing powder is the reason I got into stamping in the first place. In 1990, which is a while ago now, I was standing in a craft shop and someone was embossing some Christmas cards with some gold embossing powder, and it just took my breath away. It was just so magic to see that happening, and just I dived into stamping straight away. I think that Christmas I embossed 150 Christmas cards over a toaster, and my mum obviously saw I was very passionate about what I was doing, and she blessed me with a heat gun, and I've never turned back since having a heat gun. Now the heat gun I'm using is Heat It tool. It's a very gentle tool. It's got a wide mouth which gives a lot of heat. You can just see me, some bits on the edge didn't quite cover, so I'm just using my craft knife to colour those in. And it's quite quiet, which is good when you're doing filming and you've got small kids in the house and you don't want to distract them. But all sorts of heat guns will work, even the more powerful ones. And with the more powerful ones, you are tempted to hold your heat gun further away. It is actually really good to hold it quite close, because the quicker you get that powder melted, it means the ink underneath isn't going to dry out, so you're not going to have powder blowing away. You need to work out and play with your heat gun to see the perfect position for you, but closer is better, and a lot of people are really scared to go too close. The other thing a lot of people are really scared about is putting out too much embossing powder. You can tip out the whole container. You're not going to waste it because it goes straight back in again. This is my decoration finished with the texture of the stamp, Carabelle Studio stamp that I put into it. Excuse me. So while the glass mat that I'm working on can take heat and does have a heat pad, the reason I'm using the board is because glass retains a lot of heat and stays hot for a lot longer. So you'll find that it gets really hot to work on. The MDF doesn't heat up as fast. So now I'm working in my art journal, and I'm showing you how I did the page on the other side. So what I used is a stencil, and I just stamped through the stencil with my Versamark Pad, and I've poured on the mixed media powder straight onto my stencil page. Sorry for my head in the way. The one thing about this powder is, because it is sort of got some lumps and bumps in it, you need to sort of have a good close look to see if it's fully melted. And usually tipping it in a different direction, you can see if that's melted or not. Now, because it's only one layer in this, it dries really, really quickly. So you can go on and do this second layer. So what I've done is used a different stencil, poured a different coordinating colour over the top. So I'm using the pink, and you can see those spaces come up. And what will happen is I'll have those two images. So on the opposite page, I've done the other way. I've used the Lattice Dina Wakley stencil in the background in pink, and then I've used the green over the top. And it gives you a really, really cool effect, and you can sort of build it up. I've only ever done 2 layers doing that. I'm sure you could maybe do a few more, but obviously the more layers you put on, the more your images may blend into each other, because you're obviously putting embossing powder on top of embossing powder. So now I'm just doing a really, really quick, simple page. I had that King stamp, again a Dina Wakley stamp, already coloured in. It was sitting there, and when I did the King of the Castle, I saw the King of the Castle chipboard that I had. I thought that would be a perfect combination. I had this sort of pink and green page already planned out in my book, and I thought it would be great to work together. And of course, with the glue, it always clogs when you don't want it to. So I've always actually got some pins stuck into my box up the top so I can unclog it fairly quickly. So I'm just using a mixed media glue to glue these down. I find that's the best way. It's usually a fairly strong connection. The other thing that works really well is glossy accents. Works really, really well to glue these sorts of things down. So this is the second thing, using the Christmas decoration, and I'm using it just to show you in a different way, not in an art journal but in a card. And again, any of these things you could translate to a scrapbook page as well. So I'm just trimming off some old basic grey paper. Basic grey used to be my favourite. I'm so sad that it's not in operation anymore, but I think I've got most of the range of paper still there. I think actually this entire project was use up all your old stash, so I'm quite pleased I got it used up. One of my things I really like to do about any cut image, whether it's 2D or 3D, is to always edge it in a dark grey or a black. Just makes everything sort of show that it's actually got an edge. Now these were self-adhesive chipboard pieces, but I have put extra glue on it just in case. And I don't know if you saw, but with the star, I just use a little bit of foam tape just to pop it up to give that extra little bit of dimension. So this is the bit that slowed me down, trying to tie a proper bow to put on the top, and I couldn't get it right and I wasn't happy with it, and then I had to go looking for some different ribbon. So I found some hot pink ribbon and tried that instead, just to put up the top. And of course, I don't have great fabric glue. I couldn't find anything that would really hold it. The mixed media glue wasn't doing its job because it's gluing fabric to plastic. So I went to the Dina Wakley ultra thick gel medium, and that seemed to hold it in place. So here's a close-up of the pages that we've got using the different techniques. I hope this gives you some ideas of how to use embossing powders in your stash in a different way. They're so much fun to use, and I really encourage you to break them out and to have a go at using them in a different way, whether it be on a card, in your scrapbooks, and on a scrapbook page or in an art journal. Please stay tuned for part 2, and thanks for watching. See you next time.